part-time. Nonetheless, that is quite an achievement. This series has been running throughout this year to mark the 175th anniversary of this church, and as part of our history, remembering our rich heritage and also how it informs us in the present. It was only right to have a session to look at the surrounding area, the community and the place into which this church is placed. And so we're really grateful to Maurice for giving us that talk. Our next talk in the series in April will be on the theme of racial justice and our complicated history with people involved in all sorts of parts of those ongoing discussions. But please do put your hands together this evening to welcome Maurice for the talk on the history of the Quarry.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you very much. I didn't think I would ever be standing here in Holy Trinity Church giving a presentation, so that's a very nice treat this evening. I thought I'd be in a side room, so no, to be in the main hall is fantastic. Yes, I will. Very nice to see so many people here this evening. Emily says that I've got about 45 minutes, so some bits I will whiz through because it's quite a long presentation. So without further ado, I will get cracking. What I'm going to do this evening is give you a rough history of Quarry. If you wanted a whole history of this village and the origins of this village and the origins of this area, we'd be here for a couple of hours. So forgive me if I whiz through any pieces. I'm very happy to take some questions at the end. I was born and brought up in Quarry, and hopefully this is going to work. And the next slide is going to work, I hope. Why is this not working? Oof. So we'll look. It's okay. I can do this manually. It's all right. There we go. So I was born and brought up in Quarry, and there's me with my mum. I'll just point to me. There's me just there, just outside the main entrance. I won't tell you what year it was, but it was last century. So I was born and brought up in Quarry. I think I was probably baptised in that font just there, unless it's been replaced. No, well, that was it. I was baptised in that font just there. And my immediate family has quite a long history in Quarry. So, for example, my grandmother was born in the Mason's Arms pub. She was born up in that room just there. And I'll talk more about my family and the history of the Quarry there. And I grew up hearing about the origins of the Quarry, some tall tales, some snippets of information about the people who first settled in the Quarry. But really, it was only in the last few years that I started investigating, doing research, reading books, and trying to get a handle upon what this area is like, what this area represents, and really to understand the uniqueness of this area in relationship to the whole history of Oxford. So here's the map of Oxford. Here's a map of Quarry in 1881. It's a little bit misleading because there's one thing on there that isn't there anymore. That's the workhouse. You can see up there in the corner. That's where the estate is on Trafford Road. The London Road is at the top. This road here is not the bypass. The bypass is yet to be built. The bypass isn't built until the 1950s. And we are quite clearly marked just down there. We're there in the church. You can see this jumble of streets. And really, in 1881, this was still a village on the edge of Oxford, looking much more towards the countryside, towards Forest Hill, towards Barton, towards places like that, not really part of the city as yet. The workhouse, long demolished, raised by a housing estate. The next time you're on the London Road, look out, that is the last surviving bit of the workhouse. I don't know why they kept that particular pillar, but they did. So that's the last surviving bit of the workhouse. Built in 1838, demolished in the 1950s, I think, or the early 1960s. And I'll talk a little bit about the workhouse later. But Quarry now is a desirable place to live. It's got an enticing layout. It's full of lanes, full of hollows, full of dips, full of swirls, unexpected views. It's a place that is inviting. It's a place that I'm sure estate agents would tell you is very, very charming. But Quarry looks the way it does now because of human interaction. It's the result of an extractive industry, the result of mining stone. So nothing about this area is natural at all. It's been beautified, but essentially what you're looking at is millions of tons of here are now down there. So everything, most of what you see there, what tourists take pictures of, is from here. Not something that's particularly well recognised, but I think it's worth pointing that out. Here's a view of Oxford from 1781. This is from a painting by John Melcher on the top of Shotover. Again, to emphasise, this is a this is on the margins of Oxford, and you can see this flat plateau of land that's leading down into Oxford itself. If you would imagine ground level in Quarry is Beaumont Road. If you place the spirit level on Beaumont Road across the Quarry Wreck, that is how Quarry should look. Or everything that's taken out from underneath that line is the stone that ended up down building these lovely dreaming spires in the centre of Oxford. One of the interesting things about Oxford is it sells itself on how old it is. It's 1,000 years old. Tourists will go there, and that's one of the unique selling points of Oxford. It's a very old institution, and it trades on that. But this is not the oldest part of Oxford. We are in the oldest part of Oxford right now. There's an old Roman road, and that Roman road would have gone more or less following the bypass. If you go behind BMW, you'll see there's a place called Roman Way. The old Roman road skirted the edge of the edge of Quarry, and it would have linked Dorchester upon Thames up to a place called Alchester. Alchester is just south of Bicester. There's the footprint of Alchester, and that was an important trading route for the Romans, along which they would transfer pottery from the river up to where the Roman road intersected with places like the Fossway and Ackerman Street and those sorts of things. So it was an important trading route. And every time you will have excavations in, for example, Blackbird Leys, or for example in Cowley at the moment, in Between Towns Road, you will find archaeologists there looking for Roman remains, and they will find shards of pottery. Now, if you go down in the city centre and look for those shards of pottery, you won't find it. And that's much, I think, to the annoyance of Oxford University. They would love some Roman remains. Unfortunately, they don't. They don't have any. We do. We're the oldest part of Oxford. If you look along here, this is a very interesting piece of pottery found during the excavations in the 1970s of the Churchill site. This is part of a bowl. What is interesting on here is this is a maker's mark, and the interpretation of this is it says it's made by a Thames dweller. So this shows you this is a Roman inscription and a fragment of speech from over 2,000 years ago. Now, this gentleman here is Percy Manning. Percy Manning will feature a little bit later in our story, but Percy Manning was a Victorian gentleman archaeologist, a man of leisure, and in 1894 he discovered what were the remains of Roman kilns not too far from here, just off the Slade. Just here. There's a close here, Slade Close, I think it's called, and this is where he found the remains of Roman kilns. Again, more evidence that around here Romans would have been here. Locally, that area was a pit that would have been known as Harry Bear's Pit, or my preference, Harry Bear's Bottom. It's far more entertaining. And Harry Bear was a fictional, well, maybe it was a character who was said to communicate with his friend in Wheatley, and he would send messages to his friend in Wheatley via bow and arrow, and those messages would be shot over the hill. So that's one interpretation where you get the word name shot over from. So yeah, next time you go past Slade Close, have a little look in there, and you can see on the back wall it is clearly a pit. If you go forward to 1040, what you see here is St Michael's Tower, and this may be the first example of stone being used for this area by the Saxons. If you go down, I always think it looks like a seaside castle. It's a very rudimentary thing because this is made from coral rag. There's a high probability that this was taken from Rock Edge, not too far from here. The coral rag was extremely hard, so that means it can't be decorated or carved, but this is one of, I think, the oldest building in central Oxford, and there's a good chance it comes from around here. 1096 is key to understanding the start of the history of Quarry, because that's when you get the first indication of education happening with Oxford University. So the first evidence of teaching. And over the following centuries, that develops into the need to construct buildings, to construct permanent seats of learning. And also, by this stage, the kings and queens of England required scribes. They required educated people to start to write down the laws of the country. So Oxford University became important in producing people. So what do those people need? They need fancy buildings. So 1396, this is constructed. Now, this is New College Bell Tower. If you get the opportunity to have a look at it, fantastic building made from a material called Headington hardstone, extracted from here. Now, there's every likelihood that the Oxford University was looking for a source of stone. Transport is problematic. Where's nearby? Oh, I know that place where the Romans and the Saxons used to get their stone from. Let's go up there. It's not too far away, and if we transport it down the hill, it's down the hill all the way. So this area started to be used for the construction of stone. Now, this leads on to the bit about geology, which is where my wife, who's not here tonight, because she's heard this talk too many times, says, don't talk too much about geology, Maurice, because it's boring. I will try and make this very, very quick. This diagrammatic section shows you where we are now, very handy. This is the Vicarage Quarry, which is, well, essentially just over there. Vicarage Quarry, and a cross-section that's going through to Windmill Quarry on the corner of Windmill Road, where you've got Rock Edge. So you've got Coral Rag in the far right, coming through to Vicarage Quarry. What you see along here is the cross-section of how the stone in this area lays, and that's very important to understand that, because what you have here are bands of rock that sit horizontally in amongst bands of rubbish. So in order to extract this stone, you don't mine downwards. It's not like a coal mine. You tend to burrow through the landscape a bit like a mole. So you're looking for these stratas of rock that are between 20 and 40 centimeters wide. Once you find those rocks, a seam, you can then take that seam out. But what it means is you start to move your way through the landscape, and what you take out, you pile behind you. So you get this mixture of pits and hollows, dips and swirls, which is what we see around us right now. This is taken from Magdalen Pit. I can't think, is it called Quarry Nature Reserve, just off William Kimber Crescent. You can see here the strata of what you have. Here's another strata just here. There were two types of stone that they found here. The first type of stone was used on New College bell tower. That's hard stone. The second type of stone they found is freestone. Now, the freestone they particularly liked because it was easy to manipulate, and the masons who were producing these lovely carvings for the university liked it a great deal. Now, 1474, that's an important date because this gentleman comes on the scene. This is William Wainfleet. He was headmaster of Winchester College, he was provost of Eton College, he was Bishop of Winchester, and he's the founder of Magdalen College. If you go to Wainfleet Road in Barton, then it's named after this gentleman just here. So he decides he wants to build Magdalen College, and he employs a man called William Orchard. William Orchard was a master mason, but not high enough to get his own portraits. I'm afraid we'll just have to do with this picture of his close, which is just off Old Headington. So he's a master mason and architect, and he's employed to oversee the works, and he operates out of Magdalen Pit. He has a 2.5 acre plot of land in Quarry, and that's where he extracts the stone to build Magdalen College. Now there's the finished result. Very, very nice indeed. What it means is there's a boom in construction over the following centuries. And over the following centuries, you'll see here, the 15th century, the 16th century, the 17th century, All Souls, Merton, Divinity School, Christ Church, Merton Fellows, Sheldonian Theatre, Oriel Jesus. You can read them all up there. They're all constructed from Headington stone. Headington stone becomes incredibly sought after, incredibly desirable. William Wainfleet specifies quarry stone for the construction of Eton School and repairs to Windsor Castle. And one of the reasons of an act of 1624 to make the Thames navigable up to Oxford was to allow the transportation of stone from here down the river. So if you see Windsor Castle or Eton College, you'll know that they are all parts of Quarry. Now this leads to the pits expanding, and about 90 acres. Ignore this picture, ignore the roads on this picture. This is a much later picture. But that gives you an extent about, we are somewhere about there, I think we are. That's there. So we're just there, and you've got about 90 acres of pits that are used periodically to extract the stone to produce these wonderful colleges. Fantastic. Now the hard stone is wonderful. The hard stone is great, but as the centuries go on, they realise that freestone isn't very good at all. In fact, it reacts very, very badly to pollution. So if you look at the base of the Sheldonian Theatre and you see all this blistered and cracked stone, you can say, yes, that's quarry stone. I always think it's a slight revenge of this area on the university. They have to deal with this. This is on the bottom of the Radcliffe camera. This is on the side of the Sheldonian Theatre. And you see this sort of blistering erosion all over Oxford, and it's quarry stone. Often leads for areas to be refaced, and this is of some refacing work that's gone on in Oriel College. Now, who were the people who were doing the work in this area? So, I was always told when I was growing up, in a very romantic way, Cornish gypsies, Maurice. They were Cornish gypsies, and they would settle here, and they were going along these ancient Roman routes, and they would settle here, and they'd do work and that sort of thing. And that's a very romantic idea. And it's possible. Cinnaminter Road, that's just off the Slade, is named after a gypsy princess. Gypsy Lane, down in Headington, speaks for itself. There is a strong tradition of gypsies in this area. If you look at this census from 1911, you'll see this is from Mr. Sampson, and you'll see it says here, Gypsy Camp, Headington Quarry. If you go, this is inland much more. This is inland much more towards the Slade. If you look here in the census of 1911, there's the wonderfully named. This is the Buckland family, and you've got here the wonderfully named Ocean Buckland. That's beautiful. But if you look here where they were born, all sorts of different places. There's Wiltshire, there's Surrey. These are definitely people who are travelling around. As I say, this was the Buckland family, and I was always told that gypsies would winter here, and I was always told specifically they were proper gypsies, Maurice, in proper covered wagons. Here's a picture of a fair that used to come very regularly to Quarry. In the background, well, we're just over here. There's the Mason's Arms pub just there. There would be an annual fair in Quarry. So you would have a regular connection with people travelling around. Now, if we're fast forwarding to this sort of time, and I'm sort of thinking around the end of the 18th century, people were realising that quarry stone was less valuable. It didn't have the staying power. But was Quarry actually a village? If you look at this map just here, you'll see that there's Headington, there's Barton, two very old villages. It's marked on here as Headington. It's marked on here as Headington Quarry. But realistically, I think it's fair to say that what was happening here was irregular work. There would have been buildings, they would have popped up. There would have been workers who were working on a casual basis, because remember, the colleges didn't demand stone continuously, they would have demanded stone on occasion. So I think the settlements here would have been quite ad hoc. If you see this quote from 1630, it perhaps gives you an indication of what a mining village like this would have been like, because it says here, cottages have been built without licence in the last 15 years to house lewd and disorderly persons who despoil the forest of brushwood, disturb the king's game with their dogs, and frequent unlicensed alehouses. So, a bit of a rough place. I think it's fair to say. There's also a story about students coming up here to do some bull baiting, a minor riot, all of those things happening. We don't have any photographs about what it was like, but we do have a picture thanks to this man. This is the slightly unfortunate name, Mr. William Crotch. Crotch Crescent down off the Marston Road is named after him. But he was a polymath. He was a musician down in Oxford, a very gifted man. He was also a very interested painter. And he came up here and he painted this picture in 1800. In fact, on August the 4th at 7 p.m. He tells you exactly where it was. A copy of this is in the Six Barrels pub, what used to be the Aziz restaurant, which very sadly closed down at the weekend. So I'm not sure what's happened to this copy. But this gives you an idea about what this landscape was like after it'd been mined. You've got this small one-floor cottage up here, workers' cottage, and this really quite bleak landscape. Compare that with someone like Barton. Barton, a far more established hamlet. This picture was taken around 1900. If you look at Old Headington as well not Old Headington, but Headington. This is the centre of Headington just here. But Headington itself was not a place that was complete of moral value. The White Hart was it was a brothel for a long period of time. And this area would have attracted students. Who would have been up until, certainly at this time, all young men looking for excitement, and certainly there would have been excitement and interest in and around places like the White Hart and a mining camp in Quarry. And Headington is very much the mother village. So the Six Bells pub is so named because of the six bells of St Andrew's Church. So Oxford was changing at the latter part of the 18th century. It's becoming more prosperous. The 1771 Improvement Act set up the covered market, and you have the creation of the Oxford Pavings Commission to improve sanitary traditions in the city. Magdalen Bridge was rebuilt. There was new paving. There was street lights. And in fact, some of that street lights, even in 1778, it was specified that Headington hardstone had to be used on some of the footways. So it still was being used, but change was really on the way because Oxford was changing and Quarry was going to change with it. At the start of the 19th century, you had the Enclosure Acts. Here's a map from 1804. It's marked simply as Quarry, not Quarry Village, as Quarry. So if you're looking here, this is sort of the London Road along here, and we're about there somewhere. Again, but you've got these 90 acres of pits that you have here. So the Enclosure Acts was essentially the privatisation of common land, giving ownership to land and giving title deeds to people. And this really is the start of Quarry as a distinct place, because Oxford was becoming more prosperous, and some of that emerging middle class within Oxford were looking for places to come and set up house. One such man was a man called Joseph Locke, and he decided to build, as part of the Enclosure Act, he bought a parcel of land on what is now Bury Knoll Park. That's the library at Headington. And because the London Road had been created, London Road, I think, was turnpiked in 1775, 1776. Up until that point, the old road to London had been the old road that you see up to Shotover. So this allowed people like Locke easier access to what they would have seen as the countryside on the edge of Oxford. So Joseph Locke comes in, and the other thing to remember is that Oxford itself was quite a damp, a bit of a dirty place. And there's this lovely saying from around this time that people would say, down in Oxford, the air's like stale beer. Up in Headington, it's pure champagne. Now, that is still the same. It also explains why there's lots of hospitals up here, because hospitals were put up on the hill because that was seen as being a nice place to be. So Joseph Locke comes up here and he plays the country gentleman, and he builds a small estate here, and he thinks this is great. I can carry on my business in town, my goldsmith, my banking business in town, and I can come up here at the weekends. I can put some sheep in and around Bury Knoll Park, and I can pretend to be a farmer. Now, at this point, he does a very stupid thing, because he annoys the locals, as in he annoys the people of Quarry, because the people of Quarry at this time, remember, people are starting to live here, but their mother village is Headington. So if they want a church, they have to go to St Andrews. So there's a traditional funeral path. Chapel Alley that runs up alongside of the Methodist Church, more of that in a moment, is a straight line. Another thing to remember about the alleyways in Quarry, the whole layout of Quarry is higgledy-piggledy. The alleyways are always dead straight, because the alleyways tended to be the connecting routes between the pits. And many working pits don't want to go around the houses. So the alleyways are straight, everything else is higgledy-piggledy. So this funeral route went across where Quarry Wreck is now, over towards Stile Road. That's why it's called Stile Road, because there was a stile there. And it would go up through Mr. Locke's property. You can see up here his Bury Knoll house just here. Now, Joseph Locke thought, I've paid a lot of money for this country estate, I'm going to block off this road, block off this funeral path, which did not go down particularly well. So what you have here is the local curate, a man called James Palmer, who was a bit of a rebel. He realises that the locals in Quarry are not happy about their funeral path being blocked off. They're being denied access to their place of worship in Headington, and what he does is he writes to the bishop of Oxford at the time, and he says the following: the inhabitants of Quarry think themselves aggrieved in being deprived of this path, and seem to lay a great stress on it having been a funeral path, time immemorial. Not sure about time immemorial, but a long time. And indeed it does appear hard for the accommodation of one upstart fellow, that's Mr. Locke, the inhabitants of a whole hamlet should be distressed. The proprietor of the land, Mr. Locke, in High Street, applied to me to persuade the poor people to bring their funerals by a new path. But as that is nearly 250 yards further about, and it appeared to me not only absurd, but a kind of insult against the church itself, I flatly refused him. I am not to be dazzled by any man's wealth, and can clearly see the dangerous tendency of that blind adoration to riches which is so prevalent at the present time. So essentially, he is very firmly on the side of the people. And if you ever go to Wood Farm, Palmer Road is named after him. So, but the Bishop of Oxford, John Randolph at the time, he doesn't agree with Palmer and sides with Locke. And what you then find in 1807 is that a group of Quarry villagers who consistently knock down the blockade that Mr. Locke has put up end up at Oxford Assizes. And it says, William Coppock, Benjamin Bushnell, Charles Headington and several other persons were tried for a riot in Headington, in this county, and for forcibly entering a paddock of Joseph Locke Esquire, situate in that parish, which has been enclosed under the authority of an Act of Parliament passed in the 41st year of the present reign. All the defendants were found guilty, and William Coppock, Benjamin Bushnell, Charles Headington, Henry Bushnell, Thomas Goodgame, Peter Goodgame, Joseph Jacob were sentenced to be imprisoned in the common jail for 6 calendar months. It says here, bound over with John Adams, Anne Coppock, Rachel Goodgame, Elizabeth Bushnell, wife of Richard, Elizabeth Bushnell, single woman. So it's nice to know that the women were just as aggressive as the men. What this did mean, though, and it was really pushed along by James Coppock, was that if they weren't going to be able to have access to their church in St Andrews, in Headington, and they weren't going to be backed by the clergy, despite the best efforts of James Palmer. James Palmer, in his letters to the bishop, warns them that the people are not happy with the established church, and they are turning to Methodism. Now, this is not something. This is something that grows, and on the back of that, the first meetings, a Methodist preacher comes up from Oxford. They're around this time. They're looking to expand. Comes up from Oxford to Headington. Meetings are held in a cottage next door to the Six Bells, and very soon a chapel is built in Trinity Road, and then later a chapel is built in the one that they have now in Quarry High Street, and they are all built from public subscription. So it's the people in Quarry putting their hands in their pockets, and they're not rich people, to get this building constructed. So. And also as well, it should be noted that at the time when this building is constructed, Methodism's going through a bit of a crisis. So the fact that Quarry needs an even larger chapel shows that it's got a huge foothold in the area. So I do wonder actually if they chose that location because it's right next to the funeral path. I'm not sure. Anyway, that comes to the location, this is about the mid-19th century, and it comes to the attention of this man, Samuel Wilberforce. Now, Samuel Wilberforce is the son of William Wilberforce, the great abolitionist, and he is locally known as Soapy Sam Wilberforce. Either because he was very good in arguments, he was very erudite, very good at debating, or because he was a bit greasy. I'm not really sure. You can take your pick from that particular picture, but. He's the gentleman, if you go down, he was involved in the great debate down at the Natural History Museum in 1860. There's a memorial outside the Natural History Museum. So I think he's the guy who says, I'm not a monkey, or something like that. I can't remember. But anyway, he wants to generate an interest in Quarry because he's worried if the Methodists got a foothold, they're not going to church in St Andrews, then we need to do something about it. So what he decides he's going to do is to create a little bit of a moral panic. So what he does in a sermon on the 9th of January 1847, he says here, with every possible attention to its moral habits and the presence of a university must probably expose the surrounding villages to some peculiar temptations. This population, as in the Quarry population, has long been cursed by the neighbour of Oxford vice, which is found in the secluded character of the hamlet and in the consequent lack of rebuke of observation to fit a scene for its evil deeds. So he's setting up a situation whereby there's evil afoot in Oxford. I think he's essentially saying that students have come up here, all sorts are going on. The sermon is published, and in the preamble, Wilberforce says this: it is proposed to procure, if God permits it, the blessing of a church with a parsonage and endowment for the hamlet of Headington Quarry near Oxford. To those acquainted with the circumstances of that hamlet, no arguments are necessary to convince them of the importance of attempting to improve its condition. In a spot removed from observation, very disadvantagedly circumstance for receiving the ministrations of religion, but within near access to a neighbouring university, Evil has found a ready home, and the accumulated mischief of many years is the reason, this peculiarly pressing reason, for attempting to furnish this place, whose spiritual provisions, which, even under ordinary circumstances, its situation would seem to solicit. Now, he does seem to forget that the Methodists are here, but essentially, this is about bums on seats, isn't it? So he thinks that we need a church here. So, in very short order, by creating, dare I say it, an atmosphere of misinformation, disinformation, luckily we don't have that problem now, he generates an interest and people start to give money to build a church. And it's this church that he builds. It's a fantastic, beautiful church. To say the subscriptions largely came from the town, not from here. When this church was constructed, it is constructed of local stone, but it wasn't constructed using local labour. So I think at this stage, the locals are firmly in the Methodist camp. They've got probably a long memory about the funeral path. But the importance of this church comes from the fact of who they got to design it, which is George Gilbert Scott. So when Samuel Wilberforce comes up here to lay the foundation stone in 1848, he's employed a man who builds Martyrs Memorial and also builds the Midland Hotel at St Pancras. So it's a big hitter. It's a big hitter that he's got here. So, and also as well, this church is designed to look older than it actually is. It's a Victorian church, but there wants a sense of permanence here at the same time. So the church is here, and I think it's fair to say we're well on the way to having a village. But if we take this view that I took this picture just outside here, looking out of the churchyard down towards what is actually Taylor's Pit, this landscape has been beautified. It looks like rolling countryside, but this was a pit. This was Taylor's Pit. Now it's been planted, now it's been backfilled, now it's got grass, it looks lovely. But the reality around this time when this church would have been built would have been very stark. This would have been built on a plot of land between Taylor's Pit on that side and Blondin's Pit on that side, now Quarry Hollow Park. So remember, ground level is Beaumont Road. So this would have been a very, very stark area. There's me in Magdalen Pit. There's the last surviving pit you can see here. You can see the face just there. And if you go back to what Quarry would have been like in the mid-19th century, it would have been a pretty bleak place. Again, this is William Crotch we got to thank for a picture in 1799. Again, the workman's cottage just there up on the hill. A workman handily, I think, picking away with a pick. But this would have been a pretty bleak kind of landscape. And also as well, how is this work going on? This is from a quote from July 1840. This is a boy, George Snow, 8 years old, who was working in the pits at the time, taken down in an accident. So this would have been a harsh, bleak, very uninviting landscape. You can see here, this is the extent of the pits. The pits were still being used. They were still extracting stone to be used for things, to be used in things like sewerage, but this was not top quality stone anymore. So the houses that were being built and developed would have been perched on the side of these enormous pits. This is Beaumont Alley. If you walk down by the side of the Chequers, this is Beaumont Alley. This cottage is still here. If you can just see here, this is a horse in the bottom of the pit. That gives you a sense of scale. These pits were enormous. And I think it's fair to say, not a particularly desirable place to be. But despite that, people were beginning to move in. So by the end of the 19th century, you have here, so here's the annual sheep roast in the Six Bells Pit. And Quarry in 1841 had a population of 241 people. By 1901, it's got a population of 1,500 people. So why is it growing? Why are people coming here? Because the pits are in decline, but yet people are coming here. And I would suggest the reason is, if you look at a lot of these faces, they are young people. And they're looking for land, they're looking for opportunity. Oxford is growing, Oxford is expanding. But what you see is, in the sense of 1841, 60% of the households are under the age of 35. Now, whizzing through to the sort of people who were here, this picture was taken around 1906. They look a particularly unsavoury lot of people. This picture was taken outside the Mason's Arms pub. It hasn't changed too much at all. But yeah, and a particularly unsavoury group of people, and they're all my family. So there's my great-grandfather just there. There's my great-grandmother just there. There's an assortment of people in there, and I'll come through there. But I use this picture to illustrate what were people doing in Quarry in the late 19th century. Now, interesting to note, my great-grandfather moved here from St Ebbs. So he was from the centre of town, and he moved up here. Now, he moved here because he saw opportunities. He saw an expanding population, young people, and people needed, they needed services. If you look here, you've got children. Go back. You've got children various here. That's great Uncle Buster. That's great Auntie. I could go through more. Just to say as well, my great grandmother just there. She looks very, very tired in that picture. That was because she was going to have another 4 kids after that. So that's what she seemed to do. But if you look what the children were doing in Quarry, this is taken outside Quarry Church. Quarry School. If you walk down through School Place, that doorway is still there. These children here, you can see. This school was opened in 1864, again by public subscription, boosted by Samuel Wilberforce, wanted to help the people of Quarry. He even got donations from Stoke Newington in London to put this school up. Now, the children were known as being particularly wild in Quarry. There's a nice quote in the Oxford Times that refers to the near Zulus of Quarry, and they were known for being particularly troublesome. In the latter part of the 19th century, a rather unfortunate headmaster called Mr. Bickley was brought in to try and instill some discipline into these kids. It didn't really work particularly well. Mr. Bickley was assaulted multiple times, both by the children and by the parents. They weren't very keen on that. If I just go back a couple, I should have pointed out, just there's Uncle Buster. Uncle Buster went to school in Quarry, and there's Uncle Buster in later life. And Uncle Buster couldn't read or write, so I don't think the education programme was working very well. Uncle Buster, I didn't know, Great Uncle Buster, I didn't know, was probably one of the last Quarry men who actually lived by their wits. They lived by, as my dad said, he never had a job in his life, but he always seemed to be very well dressed. Don't ask him too much about how he got his money. But anyway, he was one of those kind of Quarry guys, and I'll come on to these guys. If you look at the men in those pictures, in the picture just here, and it is mostly men, interesting to notice the reverence between which dogs are held. If you see a lot of pictures of Quarry, there's a huge reverence to dogs. There's a reason for that, because very close to Quarry is Shotover, and on Shotover there are lots of opportunities for poaching. And in this period of time, remember, no ring road. Quarry would have been a small settlement on the edge of Oxford. You would have simply walked from Quarry straight up into the countryside, straight up into Shotover. Lots of people, you read lots of quotes. Kids in Quarry grew up on rabbits. Lots of poaching going on, and again, another reason to come and live here, because Shotover a bit of a larder, also very good for firewood, brushwood, those sorts of things. What did the other men do? Unfortunately, my grandfather, he died when he was only in his 40s, and he was also the landlord of the Mason's Arms pub. He was a bit of an entrepreneur, did a few things. I'll come on to what he did in a bit. But that left his wife Rose in a bit of a tricky situation. And to be a single woman in that era was quite difficult. So she looked around and she thought, I know, I'll marry the man next to me. That was Charlie Girls. She married him. Didn't look far. He was the lodger at the time. I don't think the death was suspicious. But anyway, she married him. And Charlie Girl was a well digger. And well digging was a very important occupation in Oxford, in Quarry, because there was no running water here until the eve of the First World War. Again, if you imagine this place, you've got big, deep pits full of water. You've got this huge post-industrial landscape, post-extractive landscape, and this is where these people were choosing to call their home. The men there, a lot of these men would have been very good workers. They would have had experience of working in the pits, and that would have meant they had muscle for hire. So some of these men, often Quarry is seen as an enclosed space. Not so. There's evidence that a lot of these men would use their muscle to travel around the country, to dig places like the Manchester Ship Canal. They were on the big Victorian engineering projects. They would go to London to dig the underground. If you look in 1851, 30 of the 93 women recorded in Quarry came from outside of Oxford, from Guildford, Bristol, London. These men would move away from Quarry. They would do work, and they would bring back back wives. This picture was taken in School Place. There's my great-grandfather again in the centre, looking very dapper. And these men would also become builders. They would adapt the skills of the masons because, again, in 19th century, Oxford was undergoing a building boom. The Dons were allowed to marry, I think, in the 1870s. Up until that point, they weren't allowed to have families. As soon as they had families, they need family housing. So then you get the expansion of Oxford into Summertown, into North Oxford. They needed houses to be built. These men became builders. They became bricklayers. They became labourers. Also, there was a brickworks at Titup. Titup Hall Drive. Titup was a small hamlet, and those brickworks would have been closely connected to Oxford. Also, these men would have been involved in seasonal work. They would have gone to farms. They would have done all sorts of things. Bit of poaching, bit of this, bit of that. They also liked to drink. There's no doubt about that. If you come to Quarry, up until recently, there were 3 pubs in Quarry. 4 if you count the Crown and Thistle. Masons, Checkers, Six Bells. Again, a hard drinking area. They were also quite political, weren't very keen on the Conservatives because when the Conservative van came round in 1909, I think it was, they tipped it over into a pit. So it was a bit of political action. The village was, most definitely solid liberal. And as I say, the pub, the Masons, would have been strictly men only. Another thing the men would have done would have been Morris dancing. This picture was taken from, I think, 1867, and men would have supplemented their income by travelling around, not just in Oxford, but perhaps going to London to perform Morris dancing to get extra cash. There are some very not some savoury stories of these guys dancing for cash in Oxford, and what the students used to do, they would heat up coins in their fires, throw the coins outside, and the men would pick up the coins and burn their hands. Boo to the university. Percy Manning, the gentleman we spoke about earlier on, Percy Manning was instrumental in persuading the Quarry men to reform, because after that picture was taken in 1876, the Quarry dancing troupe actually disbanded. It was reformed in 1898, and it was Percy Manning who bought them all new uniforms. And really, if it wasn't for Percy Manning, these people would not have been dancing outside Cecil Sharp's house in Headington, and you wouldn't have had this huge, big Quarry revival. The interesting thing from my point of view, and we haven't got enough time tonight, is that Quarry was a very young village, and it's often seen as the home of Morris dancing. But a lot of the traditions and the songs and the tunes would have had to have come from outside of this area. So I think there would have been a huge amount of external influence, and again, possibly from gypsy connections as well. Now, probably the most important thing that I'm just coming to the end is, what were the women doing in this? Well, first they were probably having lots of babies. They were probably being incredibly long suffering as well. Certainly, when I was growing up, when my great grandmother remarried Charlie Girl, my grandmother would say she had to be very keen, because when he had a job digging a well, she wanted to know when that job was going to finish, because on the day it finished, he was going to get paid, and she wanted to be there when he got paid, because if he got paid and she wasn't there, she might not see him for 2 weeks, could be go off on a drinking bender. So a lot of these women were incredibly long suffering. So what you find is that you have a huge, big explosion in Quarry of laundries. These women would often take to laundries, long gardens up here, fresh, clean air, the expanding university, huge numbers of tablecloth shirts would have to be washed and ironed, and you had the expanding places of North Oxford, domestic servants. So laundry was carted up here from those areas to be washed by hand in laundries. Some of those laundries were in large collective laundry houses. Some of them were just on lean-tos to the side of Quarry cottages. So some women worked as a collective, some women worked individually. Incredibly hard work, because when that washing had to be washed, ironed and dried no matter what the weather was. So again, you look in some of the first-hand accounts, and people would come into cottages and there would just be nails everywhere, because if it was raining outside, the washing would be held up inside the cottages. Incredibly hard work. And again, you would have women really holding the household together, because their men could be off digging the underground, or could be off drinking, or could be off poaching, whatever. It was the women who were clearly holding everything together. One of the interesting things to note, and this is This is what my great-grandfather did when he came up from St Ebbs. He started up these things. These are called haggle carts. And what used to happen in and around, especially in Quarry, was there was no tram that came up into Headington because Headington Hill was considered too steep. So these haggle carts would be used to transport things around, building materials and in particular washing. So for example, the men, not the women, the men would take the carts, pick up the washing from say Oriel College in the centre of town, take it back up the hill, have it washed and ironed, and then take it back down to deliver it back to the college or the important person, whoever it was. Now again, when that happened, that's when they got paid. So there's lots of stories about these men. It was said that horses returning to Quarry would instinctively stop at every single pub on the way back. And often by the time they got back, all the money was taken. There's actually a report in the Oxford Mail about two gentlemen. I'm afraid one of them was William Goddell, my great-grandfather, who were prosecuted for being drunk in charge of a haggle cart. So obviously it was a bit of a beano. But you do have this sense of Quarry growing up, becoming a real inclusive community on the back of hard work. And remember as well, this was a completely working class community. People flocked here because it was undesirable. There was no middle class here. There was very few households who had servants. This was like a self-sustaining working class community that you have here. And that meant there were lots of shops in the Quarry. I'll just go through some of the old shops. And like I say, this a very independent community, a very strong community. Insular, the words that I was always told growing up, very clannish, very, very clannish, but essentially people who looked after their own. One of the things to remember is, I mentioned the workhouse earlier on. If you look at the workhouse records, I think only 2 people from Quarry actually went to that workhouse. So again, people were looking after their own. There's a nice story as well that a lot of the long gardens were used for almost peasant farming. So people would grow their own vegetables, they would keep chickens, they would keep pigs. And there was also a thing in Quarry called a pig club. So every year people would get together with their pigs and they would put money into the pig club, and it was like an insurance policy. If anything happened to your pig, you could claim on your pig club insurance policy. So lots of communal things happening there. Lots of shops. We used to have lots of shops in Quarry. This is the lovely Mrs. Kislingberry's fish and chip shop. Some people might remember. This is what it looks like now. The fish and chip shop was just there, knocked down to build these 2 houses in the 1980s. We used to have a lovely butcher's in the Quarry High Street. Lewis is the butcher's just there on the corner. This is what it looks like now. The first post office in Quarry was not too far from here, up on Beaumont Road. That was done by Mrs. Cooper, and it was demolished, and Cooper Place was built behind it. There was also a post office in Pitts Road. That's what it used to look like. And in desperation, I had to take this picture about not that long ago. But this is what it looks like now. But we have lost a lot of those shops. And obviously, as Headington expanded, we lost those shops. The biggest change for Quarry came with this man. This is William Maurice. He built a car factory in the 20th century. And suddenly, all this way of life that you had for people who were poachers or builders or doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that changed, because there was suddenly lots of work going on at the car factory. And this became a satellite town. By 1939, Quarry and Headington were included as part of Oxford itself. So the idea that you were going to be a poacher or itinerant worker was really gone. Oxford changed again. You had the construction of the bypass. This is Green Road Roundabout. Here's just the edge of Quarry, just here. Risinghurst was built in 1930s, again, to accommodate car workers. And what you see here is, I mentioned earlier on this map, you've got the workhouse. If you see just here, this is the Six Bells pub. Quarry used to be a whole lot bigger, but the bypass where this red line is was used. So a whole section of Quarry, this section of Quarry, was knocked down to accommodate the bypass. So again, that really blocked off the connection that Quarry would have had between itself and the countryside. And I'll just finish off with the link that William Maurice has got to here. William Maurice grew up in Church Cowley, and his grandfather, William Pether, There's a Pether Road over in Wood Farm. He owned Brasenose Farmhouse, and he had a farm out there, and he was in constant dispute with the people of Quarry over farming. He thought that he had rights to take on farming. The people of Quarry thought otherwise, and were always in dispute with him. William Pether is buried in the churchyard. There's his grave just by the road to by the path to the vicarage. So I recommend you go and have a little look at that. One of the upshots is that because of that dispute with William Pether, that's why we have Quarry Recreation Ground, because in order to appease the people of Quarry who kept annoying him, they were given Quarry Recreation Ground as something in return for that. So I don't know how I've done for time. Not too bad. I've spoken very quickly. I'm very happy to take any questions at all. Thank you. Not too bad.